Immense. I'm a real slam bang, honest to goodness. Three-fisted humdinger. I'm a bona fide Supraman. Superman? Clevenger cried. Superman? Supraman, Yossarian corrected. Hey, fellas, cut it out, Nately begged with embarrassment. Everybody's looking at us. You're crazy, Clevenger shouted vehemently, his eyes filling with tears. You've got a Jehovah complex. I think everyone is Nathaniel. Clevenger arrested himself in mid-declamation, suspiciously. Who's Nathaniel? Nathaniel who? Inquired Yossarian innocently. Clevenger skirted the trap neatly. You think everybody is Jehovah. You're no better than Raskolnikov. Who? Yes, Raskolnikov, who... Raskolnikov? Who... I mean it, who felt he could justify killing an old woman. No better than? Yes, justify. That's right, with an axe. And I can prove it to you. Gasping furiously for air, Clevenger enumerated Yossarian's symptoms, an unreasonable belief that everybody around him was crazy, a homicidal impulse to machine gun strangers, retrospective falsification, an unfounded suspicion that people hated him and were conspiring to kill him. But Yossarian knew he was right because, as he explained to Clevenger, to the best of his knowledge, he had never been wrong. Everywhere he looked was a nut, and it was all a sensible young gentleman like himself could do to maintain his perspective amid so much madness. And it was urgent that he did, for he knew his life was in peril. Yossarian eyed everyone he saw warily when he returned to the squadron from the hospital. Milo was away too, in Smyrna for the fig harvest. The mess hall ran smoothly in Milo's absence. Yossarian had responded ravenously to the pungent aroma of spicy lamb while he was still in the cab of the ambulance, bouncing down along the knotted road that lay like a broken suspender between the hospital and the squadron. There was shish kebab for lunch, huge savory hunks of spitted meat sizzling like the devil over charcoal after marinating 72 hours in a secret mixture Milo had stolen from a crooked trader in the Levant, served with Iranian rice and asparagus tips, Parmesan, followed by Cherry's Jubilee for dessert, and then steaming cups of fresh coffee with Benedictine and brandy. The meal was served in enormous helpings on damask tablecloths by the skilled Italian waiters. Major Blank de Coverley had kidnapped from the mainland and given to Milo. Yossarian gorged himself in the mess hall until he thought he would explode and then sagged back in a contented stupor, his mouth filmy with a succulent residue. None of the officers in the squadron had ever eaten so well as they ate regularly in Milo's mess hall, and Yossarian wondered a while if it wasn't perhaps all worth it. But then he burped and remembered that they were trying to kill him, and he sprinted out of the mess hall wildly and ran looking for Doc Danica to have himself taken off combat duty and sent home. He found Doc Danica in sunlight, sitting on a high stool outside his tent. 50 missions, Doc Danica told him, shaking his head. The colonel wants 50 missions. But I've only got 44. Doc Danica was unmoved. He was a sad, bird-like man with the spatulate face and scrubbed, tapering features of a well-groomed rat. 50 missions, he repeated, still shaking his head. The colonel wants 50 missions. Chapter 3. Havermeyer. Actually, no one was around when Yossarian returned from the hospital but Orr and the dead man in Yossarian's tent. The dead man in Yossarian's tent was a pest, and Yossarian didn't like him, even though he had never seen him. Having him lying around all day annoyed Yossarian so much that he had gone to the orderly room several times to complain to Sergeant Towser, who refused to admit that the dead man even existed, which, of course, he no longer did. It was still more frustrating to try to appeal directly to Major, the long and bony squadron commander, who looked a little bit like Henry Fonda in distress and went jumping out the window of his office each time Yossarian bullied his way past Sergeant Towser to speak to him about it. The dead man in Yossarian's tent was simply not easy to live with. He even disturbed Orr, who was not easy to live with either, and who, on the day Yossarian came back, was tinkering with the faucet that fed gasoline into the stove he had started building while Yossarian was in the hospital. "What are you doing?" Yossarian asked guardedly, when he entered the tent, although he saw it once. "There's a leak here," Orr said. "I'm trying to fix it." "Please stop it," said Yossarian. "You're making me nervous." "When I was a kid," Orr replied, "I used to walk around all day with crab apples in my cheeks. One in each cheek." Yossarian put aside the musette bag from which he had begun removing his toilet articles and braced himself suspiciously. A minute passed. "Why?" he found himself forced to ask finally. Orr tittered triumphantly. "Because they're better than horse chestnuts," he answered. Orr was kneeling on the floor of the tent. He worked without pause, taking the faucet apart, spreading all the tiny pieces out carefully, counting and then studying each one interminably as though he had never seen anything remotely similar before, and then reassembling the whole small apparatus, over and over and over and over again, with no less of patience or interest, no sign of fatigue, no indication of ever concluding. Yossarian watched him tinkering and felt certain he would be compelled to murder him in cold blood if he did not stop. His eyes moved toward the hunting knife that had been slung over the mosquito net bar by the dead man the day he arrived. The knife hung beside the dead man's empty leather gun holster, from which Havermeyer had stolen the gun. "When I couldn't get crab apples," Orr continued, "I used horse chestnuts. Horse chestnuts are about the same size as crab apples and actually have a better shape, although the shape doesn't make it matter a bit." "Why did you walk around with crab apples in your cheeks?" Yossarian asked again. "That's what I asked." "Because they've got a better shape than horse chestnuts," Orr answered. "I just told you that." "Why," swore Yossarian at him approvingly, "you evil-eyed, mechanically aptituded, disaffiliated son of a bitch, did you walk around with anything in your cheeks?" "I didn't," Orr said, "walk around with anything in my cheeks. I walked around with crab apples in my cheeks. When I couldn't get crab apples, I walked around with horse chestnuts in my cheeks." Orr giggled. Yossarian made up his mind to keep his mouth shut and did. Orr waited. Yossarian waited longer. "One in each cheek," Orr said. "Why?" Orr pounced. "Why what?" Yossarian shook his head, smiling, and refused to say. "It's a funny thing about this valve," Orr mused aloud. "What is?" Yossarian asked. "Because I wanted," Yossarian knew. "Jesus Christ, why did you want apple cheeks?" "Apple cheeks?" Yossarian demanded. "I wanted apple cheeks," Orr repeated. "Even when I was a kid, I wanted apple cheeks someday, and I decided to work at it until I got them. And by God, I did work it until I got them, and that's how I did it. With crab apples in my cheeks all day long," he giggled again. "One in each cheek. Why did you want apple cheeks?" "I didn't want apple cheeks," Orr said. "I wanted big cheeks. I didn't care about the color so much, but I wanted them big. I worked at it just like one of those crazy guys you read about who go around squeezing rubber balls all day long just to strengthen their hands. In fact, I was one of those crazy guys. I used to walk around all day with rubber balls in my hands, too." "Why?" "Why what? Why did you walk around all day with rubber balls in your hands?" "Because rubber balls," said Orr, "are better than crab apples?" Orr sniggered as he shook his head. "I did it to protect my good reputation in case anyone ever caught me walking around with crab apples in my cheeks. With rubber balls in my hands, I could deny there were crab apples in my cheeks. Every time someone asked me why I was walking around with crab apples in my cheeks, I just opened my hands and showed them it was rubber balls I was walking around with, not crab apples, and that they were in my hands, not my cheeks. It was a good story. But I never knew if it got across or not, since it's pretty tough to make people understand you when you're talking to them with 2 crab apples in your cheeks." Yossarian found it pretty tough to understand him then, and he wondered once again if Orr wasn't talking to him with the tip of his tongue in one of his apple cheeks. Yossarian decided not to utter another word. It would be futile. He knew Orr, and he knew there was not a chance in hell of finding out from him then why he had wanted big cheeks. It would do no more good to ask than it had done to ask him why that whore had kept beating him over the head with her shoe that morning in Rome in the cramped vestibule outside the open door at Nately's whore's kid sister's room. She was a tall, strapping girl with long hair and incandescent blue veins converging populously beneath her cocoa-colored skin where the flesh was most tender. And she kept cursing and shrieking and jumping high up into the air on her bare feet to keep right on hitting him on the top of his head with the spiked heel of her shoe. They were both naked and raising a rumpus that brought everyone in the apartment into the hall to watch, each couple in a bedroom doorway, all of them naked except the aproned and sweatered old woman, who clucked reprovingly, and the lecherous, dissipated old man who cackled aloud hilariously through the whole episode with a kind of avid and superior glee. The girl shrieked and Orr giggled. Each time she landed with the heel of her shoe, Orr giggled louder, infuriating her still further that she flew up still higher into the air for another shot at his noodle, her wondrously full breasts soaring all over the place like billowing pennants in a strong wind, and her buttocks and strong thighs shimmying this way and that way like some horrifying bonanza. She shrieked and Orr giggled right up to the time she shrieked and knocked him cold with a good solid crack on the temple that made him stop giggling and sent him off to the hospital in a stretcher with a hole in his head that wasn't very deep and a very mild concussion that kept him out of combat only 12 days. Nobody could find out what had happened, not even the cackling old man and clucking old woman who were in a position to find out everything that happened in that vast and endless brothel with its multitudinous bedrooms on facing sides of the narrow hallways going off in opposite directions from the spacious sitting room with its shaded windows and single lamp. Every time she met Orr after that, she'd hoist her skirts up over her tight white elastic panties and, jeeringly, coarsely, bulge her firm round belly out at him, cursing him contemptuously, and then roaring with husky laughter as she saw him giggle fearfully and take refuge behind Yossarian. Whatever he had done or tried to do or failed to do behind the closed door of Nately's whore's kid sister's room was still a secret. The girl wouldn't tell Nately's whore or any of the other whores or Nately or Yossarian. Orr might tell, but Yossarian had decided not to utter another word. "Do you want to know why I wanted big cheeks?" Orr asked. Yossarian kept his mouth shut. "Do you remember," Orr said, "that time in Rome when that girl who can't stand you kept hitting me over the head with the heel of her shoe? Do you want to know why she was hitting me?" It was still impossible to imagine what he could have done to make her angry enough to hammer him over the head for 15 or 20 minutes, yet not angry enough to pick him up by the ankles and dash his brains out. She was certainly tall enough, and Orr was certainly short enough. Orr had buck teeth and bulging eyes to go with his big cheeks and was even smaller than young Hoople, who lived on the wrong side of the railroad tracks in the tent in the administration area in which Hungry Joe lay screaming in his sleep every night. The administration area in which Hungry Joe had pitched his tent by mistake lay in the center of the squadron between the ditch with its rusted railroad tracks and the tilted black bituminous road. The men could pick up girls along that road if they promised to take them where they wanted to go, buxom, young, homely, grinning girls with missing teeth whom they could drive off the road and lie down in the wild grass with. And Yossarian did whenever he could, which was not nearly as often as Hungry Joe, who could get a Jeep but couldn't drive. The tents of the enlisted men in the squadron stood on the other side of the road alongside the open-air movie theater in which, for the daily amusement of the dying, ignorant armies clashed by night on a collapsible screen, and to which another USO troop came that same afternoon. The USO troops were sent by General P.P. Peckham, who had moved his headquarters up to Rome and had nothing better to do while he schemed against General Dreedel. General Peckham was a general with whom neatness definitely counted. He was a spry, suave, and very precise general who knew the circumference of the equator and always wrote, quote, "enhanced," end of quote, when he meant, quote, "increased," end of quote. He was a prick, and no one knew this better than General Dreedel, who was incensed by General Peckham's recent directive requiring all tents in the Mediterranean theater of operations to be pitched along parallel lines, with entrances facing back proudly toward the Washington Monument. To General Dreedel, who ran a fighting outfit, it seemed a lot of crap. Furthermore, it was none of General Peckham's goddamn business how the tents in General Dreedel's wing were pitched. There then followed a hectic jurisdictional dispute between these overlords that was decided in General Dreedle's favor by ex-PFC Wintergreen, mail clerk at 27th Air Force Headquarters. Wintergreen determined the outcome by throwing all communications from General Peckham into the wastebasket. He found them too prolix. General Dreedle's views, expressed in less pretentious literary style, pleased ex-PFC Wintergreen and were sped along by him in zealous observance of regulations. General Dreedle was victorious by default. To regain whatever status he had lost, General Peckham began sending out more USO troops than he had ever sent out before and assigned to Colonel Cargill himself the responsibility of generating enough enthusiasm for them. But there was no enthusiasm in Yossarian's group. In Yossarian's group, there was only a mounting number of enlisted men and officers who found their way solemnly to Sergeant Towser several times a day to ask if the orders sending them home had come in. They were men who had finished their 50 missions. There were more of them now than when Yossarian had gone into the hospital, and they were still waiting. They worried and bit their nails. They were grotesque, like useless young men in a depression. They moved sideways like crabs. They were waiting for the orders sending them home to safety to return from 27th Air Force Headquarters in Italy. And while they waited, they had nothing to do but worry and bite their nails and find their way solemnly to Sergeant Towser several times a day to ask if the orders sending them home to safety had come.